Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Retro Monster Truck Review. I'm your host with the most, Josh Rhodes, here to bring you a little bit different episode. We're not really reviewing any specific race. This one is just Monster Truck Rivalries. This is part one of this kind of a series that I plan on doing. We'll do more of these down the road. This one is specifically TNT Motorsports Rivalries, and I couldn't think of two better people to have on the show other than Robby Haught, the guy that runs the allmonster.com website, as well as the All Monster Videos YouTube channel. If you want to check it out, I just did a podcast with him not too long ago that's up on All Monster Videos on YouTube if you want to check it out. Also joining me on the show this week is Jason Rona. He's coming back again, ladies and gentlemen. He's been on this show two other times. He covered the Pontiac Silverdome show, which I dubbed Kramer's Revenge. He also covered Louisville 1990 with me on the third episode of this podcast. If y'all want to go back and check that out or check those episodes out, they're available for download here on the Spotify channel as well as our iTunes. And, of course, they're over on YouTube as well. Please keep liking, commenting, and subscribing to that channel over there on the YouTube page. Also, give us 5-star reviews over there on iTunes. It really helps this podcast get out there to more eyeballs and more ears for everybody to listen to. But without further ado, let's just jump right into this here. TNT Motorsports Monster Truck Rivalries here on the Retro Monster Truck Review. Hello again, everybody. Welcome to the Retro Monster Truck Review. A little bit different of a conversation that we have going on this week. We've got Robby Haught, the owner of allmonster.com, as well as the All Monster Videos channel. I was just on a podcast with him not too long ago over there. You can go check it out on that channel on YouTube. And we've also got Jason Rona here, the owner of J Concepts, and we're going to be talking to you guys about rivalries in the TNT Motorsports era, and mainly 88 to about 1990. But heck, I know between the three of us, we're probably going to get a little off kilter every now and then in between this, guys, but so far I think we're going to do a really good job with this one. I think we put together a good little list of some of the best rivalries in TNT.
Super excited to be here, man. It is great to be on the Retro Monster Truck Review. You know, I'm sending people your way and vice versa. Super excited for the rivalries, man. This was the best era in monster trucks to me.
Yeah, and absolutely, Josh. I appreciate you again letting me come on the show and talk monster trucks, and it's always a blast. I listen when I'm not when it's available. I definitely listen to the episodes, and the ones you've been doing with Matt have been very good, and yeah, just I always look forward to them, and thanks for having me on.
Hey, no problem, guys. I really wanted to get you guys in here specifically for this because, like I said, we're all big TNT Motorsports heads as far as I'm concerned anyway, and my God, when TNT really got started was with one certain rivalry in particular, and I think you guys know exactly where I'm going to go with this, and that's Bigfoot and USA 1. That was the Chevy-Ford rivalry that really got things going as far as TNT was really concerned, to be honest with you. You turn on TV, and the first thing you usually hear was Bigfoot, USA 1, Ford, Chevrolet. Those were the names that always popped out there. Just to toss it out there to you guys, what was maybe your favorite race between Bigfoot and USA 1?
You can go first. I'll come in. I'll come in next.
He's got some things to do.
See, I was going to toss it to you, but I mean, the first one that just comes to mind is the one that's the dead obvious one, is the Freedom Hall, where Lutzow really, in my opinion, started making a name for himself as a guy that was willing to go all out with his equipment. You know, there were some drivers, make no mistake, that had to take it a little easier on their equipment. Hey, they had that big True Value sponsorship. They had Everett Jasmer's full support, and Lutzow was like, you know what? This is over, and I'm going to make sure with my right foot that this is over, and I don't care about the consequences. It really established him as a force to be reckoned with. You know, there was still, and there's still a mystique behind Bigfoot's name today, but obviously it's on a different level. At the time, I think Bigfoot was just a truck that was almost unbeatable. You know, you looked at that truck and you went, oh man, I'm going to get put on the trailer if you're in the other seat.
Yeah, and let's be real here. This rivalry chronicled like an hour-long documentary that was released last year on a television show called Autobiography that you can get on Discovery Plus. Basically, the whole rivalry started with Everett Jasmer driving 200 miles to go meet Bob Chandler and then eventually pulling him out of the mud. And then you skip ahead and you go all the way to this championship rivalry that we have here. And I mean, the Freedom Hall race is the first one that really jumps out to me. But as we got started talking here before Robby joined in on the conversation, just off camera and off air, Jason was pointing out a Buffalo, New York race that had happened, and it was one of those famous ones where Rod Litzow gets his nickname, and that's Flipper.
Yeah, I mean, they had a lot of good races with each other, you know, and as you pointed out down the line, you know, when you get into the Gravedigger side of things, not as many matchups with the Bigfoot truck as I think maybe they had with the USA 1 here in this very first 88 season and 89. One of the matchups I was thinking of that I remember watching when I was a kid was it's when they had the really basically there's the TNT video of it, and then there's also the Bigfoot video that they put up recently on their YouTube channel where I believe Rich Hoosier beat USA 1 in the finals there. There was the good lane, bad lane. It's probably another good retro monster truck review episode, of course. There's a good lane, bad lane situation. And I remember kind of watching that one as a kid, and somehow Rich kind of pulled off the win there. And I was thinking, okay, well, you know, maybe this championship is still going to go their way, considering USA 1 was making such a hard push towards the middle to end of that season. And then Rich kind of got another win there. And I was like, all right, well, maybe it's still going to come together. Of course, you know, like you brought up the Freedom Hall event where USA 1 rolls over is kind of the end of it. But that's kind of one I think of right off the top of my head. There's a bunch of them on the U-turn track where they did one of the rare U-turn tracks.
I think that was Toledo, if I remember correctly.
That was a good final.
That was a very good final. And the joke is, USA 1 can't turn. But Everett's truck was always really competitive on that particular track, as well as the Louisville Figure 8 track. Those longer, wider turns seem to really favor the USA 1 truck.
Yeah, I always kind of wondered about Louisville Motor Speedway if you actually needed rear wheel steering on that course. I always kind of wondered how much they were using of the rear steer on that course. I've seen guys using it, of course, but you kind of wondered, did you actually need it with those big turns or not?
And what do you think, Robbie?
I was going to say, there was always that was a great question to ask, I think, Jason, is the rear steering, because there is a fine line with the speeds you're going at and with how tight the turns have to be. You would see a lot of people on the Figure 8 track in the first half of the 8, if you will, spin out, because they'd be pushing it too hard, trying to get the lead going into the second half of it. And if you want to talk about leads, I mean, it's impossible to not jump all over the place with this stuff. Let's be real. You want to talk about leads and comebacks. There was a certain Bigfoot 4 comeback where he had to push it. I didn't see much rear steer there, but it was important to kind of have a truck that would lean, if you will, one way to the other. If you're too
body
stiff,
roll was very important.
Yeah, if your body roll is super important, and also to meet tire pressure. You had to think about that from a crew guy's perspective. I know just from my brief experience with Charlie Pauken, I mean, you would think a 2-second straight line course, for example, okay, set it and forget it, right? No, he was back there telling us, well, you know, if you could take 5 pounds of pressure out of the back tires, then I could hook up on the line more and we'd win. And little stuff like that may get overlooked when you're just doing the eye test. But if you think about it from that perspective, the crew guys had a big, you know, advantage, if you will, when it comes to like USA 1. Steve Wilkie's in there wrenching on things, and the Bigfoot guys just had a ton of people that worked their way up from crew guys to drivers. They had a lot of experience, and they had a lot of I think of an advantage in that sense. They knew how to set trucks up for the courses and didn't just have one stock setup for everything. So I think that plays their advantage on courses like that, and then also in the points championship.
Speaking of the points championship, we'll roll right into it here. 1988, first point series championship for monster trucks, brought to you by TNT Motorsports. It all ends up in Freedom Hall, and the one thing that we really should note here is how they decided a champion for TNT. Of course, USA 1 goes on to win the points championship, much to Jason Rona's chagrin. We have 39 race stretch here for these trucks, but only 29 of those events were actually counted towards points. I kind of get why TNT would do this, because honestly, you would just never know which trucks would show up to which event each weekend. And I imagine there were some TNT events that were booked on the same weekend in completely different parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, and you kind of wish that they were a little more upfront about this during the telecast. But as you said, that, 88, 89, and then things kind of peaked out in 90, where I'm sure they, this information would have been more relative, to tell the fans. But I remember in 88, there really wasn't a lot of information back then. It was just, what was going on. And then at the end, all of a sudden, it's like, all right, well, this race is for the championship. And you're like, okay, well, what happened here? Why is this? And so, yeah, it was, it would have been nice to have all that information going at the time. But like you said, in RC points races that we do in off-road, we do drops, which is the same thing that essentially they're doing here. Is they're, if we have 8 race series or something like that, we might do best, 6 of 8 or something like that. So it allows a guy to have 2 bad events and just completely throw them away, and it's your best 6 of 8. So, I'm familiar with the drop system because we do that a lot in RC point series, but I didn't really know what was going on in this thing until,
Years later.
Almost 30 years later, right? 20 something years later, and you're like, oh, okay, now I kind of
That's
understand.
how it happened, kind of thing that kind of hits you there.
Man, even in 89 and 90, I mean, you were talking about later on, they said it more. They showed the points, but, if you didn't pay attention to what Scott Douglas was saying, when they showed the points, he'd say, oh, sometimes, Equalizer's in an event in Atlanta and broke down. Like, if you didn't hear it, and you didn't pay attention to 100% of that thing. When I was a little kid, man, I had my nose to the TV eating the cereal, you know what I'm saying? And if you didn't pay attention to it, you missed it, and you'd just be like, oh, why did Gravedigger drop 5 spots? Well, he crashed in New York or something. You just didn't know. Information wasn't as readily available, so it was must-see TV when they were on.
To make a long story short here about the point system, despite Bigfoot accumulating more points in 1988 through those 39 races, only its best 29 were counted, and USA 1 ends up coming out with a score of a 292.5 to Bigfoot's 278. It's a stunning upset because, honestly, what Robby was talking about earlier, when you saw Bigfoot on TV, a lot of the times you automatically assumed it would win. It was like Richard Petty back in the day for NASCAR. You turn on NASCAR highlights, oh, Petty won. What a shock.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was completely heartbreaking watching that last race in Louisville, and you're like, this is it. This is this one race, and USA 1 flips over, and all of a sudden it's still the champion. I mean, I was so confused. It's like so heartbreaking, but it was, but then when years later, I start kind of wondering to myself, well, it's also a little bit of the fault of the Bigfoot guys for not seeing sort of the writing on the wall, what was going to happen during that season, and say, okay, so if we do know it's going to be best of events and our truck is, our lead is evaporating here, it seemed like it took a long time for them to respond and make changes, and USA 1 had the faster truck and they ran on straight line courses, and that truck was set up to do that. The Bigfoot truck wasn't. It was set up to do more of an array of type of courses, and they ultimately suffered because of that.
Who can forget those 12-car jumps at the Milwaukee Mile? USA 1 just flying and lit. And it wasn't just the setup is super important. I agree with you, Jason. It's also the driver. I mean, you saw that later on. To jump around again when Steve Wilkie took the wheel and struggled a little bit, when Litzau was injured and everything. And, there's the combination of the truck and the driver. And obviously no disrespect to Hoosier, Litzau, Wilkie, any of those guys. But, you have to have that right combination, that winning combination for any course. And we'll get into, Gary Porter later, but, he would be, it might be a hot take or something, but he would be my pick, Gary Porter, to win any event with any truck. If you put him through a randomizer, I think that's the guy that is the consistent guy, and that's how you see the evolution of the point series too. Is that nickname he got, Mr. Consistency, was there for a reason. Are you going to try to go all out like USA 1 and maybe not be able to make 6 or 7 events because you got to stop for repairs? Or are you going to be just steady as a rock and hope that somebody else slips up like a Gary Porter? I mean, it was an interesting kind of push for that. And I would also say, to make another quick point, I would say that 88 had a big effect on 90, when it comes to the Bigfoot team and also the evolution of the sport. You touched on
88 had a big effect on Bigfoot in 88, 89, and 90. Because as we all know, 89, Bigfoot sits out for a little while as we go into the next section of my notes here. 2 years later, after 88, it was Chandler's turn to come out with a radically new truck and run for a national champion. However, at that point, Bigfoot didn't have one rivalry. It had many. Bigfoot versus the world here, basically, in TNT when 1990 came around. And I got to tell you guys, the first name that pops into my head is Gary Cook and Equalizer as far as rivalries for Bigfoot in this particular TNT season. It was the rivalry for Bigfoot, honestly, because when they start out in Memphis, night 1, everybody's looking at Bigfoot like, oh my God, look at this truck, how fast it is. Equalizer ends up taking the win, albeit due to a broken transmission in Bigfoot. Night 2, it's almost a dead heat, but they end up giving it to Bigfoot. And then night 3 is like the rubber match between those 3. It's some of the best television in a while.
That was the tie, right?
Definitely, yeah, that was the tie.
Yeah.
I mean, it's some of the best television that they've really ever produced, as far as I'm concerned, in Monster Truck Challenge, and we will definitely be covering that show on our Retro Monster Truck review here in the future. But what do you guys think? 1990 Bigfoot.
Well, yeah, Equalizer for sure. And to me, this 88, when I started making notes about this show, and you're talking about the rivalries, and, we talked about this just a little bit. And I started typing on my phone, and I'm going, okay, Bigfoot versus USA 1, Bigfoot versus Kong, Bigfoot versus Gravedigger. And I'm like, just like, you said, this was Bigfoot versus everybody. Is what, to me, this 88, 89, and 90 was really all about. That was the height of probably their sponsorships. That was the height of their dominance around. And I think obviously everybody else was jealous of those opportunities that they had. And I think it was for the the mid-card trucks, it was, if they could just beat a Bigfoot truck here or there, that was a big win for them. And then the top tier trucks, the USA 1s and whoever, the Kongs, and then Equalizer, as you talked about, those were the real competitors in terms of speed and maybe a little bit of backing, or just in Equalizer's case, good designing.
You said the D word, Jason. Design. Man, that's when everything started to really turn to me. As we moved to 88, 89, 90, the eyes were on Equalizer, make no mistake, like Josh said. You've got a totally different setup. You've got a coilover setup, and people are looking around like, oh boy, I think I need to get into this off-road technology. And a few people are sitting down at the computer. The first name that comes to mind is Scott Stevens, and I got a quick story that kind of sums him and rivalries up. I would like to preface this by saying, personal opinion, I really enjoyed watching Scott run, and it's great to see the next generation with Colt as well. However, I brought an old TNT Motorsports booklet of pictures, film pictures. Remember those? And It was from the Bowling Green event, I believe was 1990 Bowling Green event, and had, pictures of King Kong, and, you want to talk about clearing cars and all that, we can get there too. But he was doing a ton of great things. Gave that to Dennis Anderson to take a look at in West Lebanon, and the first thing he did was flip to a picture of Scott Stevens, look at it and go, there's the old crybaby. And man, you know what? It made for good TV, though. I loved, people would say, well, he's complaining, but you know what? He wanted an even playing field, and he wanted to call out things that he saw in his mind that weren't fit. And I did like that about him, that he was willing to speak up and not just lay down for these guys. Jason talks about the mid-card kind of drivers. I would classify Stevens as an upper mid-card guy when his stuff held together. And I really value those upper mid-card guys when it comes to a great show nowadays and beyond, of course. Stevens was the guy that would push people, push people, push people. He tore that truck in half in Memphis trying to win in the background of Porter and Brass and everybody going at it in 90. There's a ton of things we could talk about
He tore
with
that
Scott
truck
Stevens.
apart in Kalamazoo, Michigan, too.
Oh,
if I remember correctly, that one where he rolls and comes back, one of the first times you would ever see that in monster trucks. Stevens was a guy that had a big mouth, but he knew how to back it up on the racetrack as well. My favorite quote from 1990 as far as Stevens and Bigfoot was him just kind of nonchalantly saying in Flemington, "Yeah, truck of the future right there," and the old auto value special keeps putting him on the trailer.
I liked it, though. I don't mind a guy that's willing to talk a little bit of trash and have a little rivalries. It's almost too nice nowadays. And I'm not mean to be one of those get off my lawn kind of guys, but I like a rivalry, even a friendly rivalry. Josh, I got to ask you real quickly: Are you allowed to have any naughty words on your podcast?
No.
Okay, good. Well, I'm gonna say there was a moment that people might miss, even the TNT heads. Gary Porter and Dennis Anderson, friendly rivalry, neighbors, if you will, in North Carolina. Once Dennis moved from Virginia, and there was an event, and I'll leave it up to you guys to find this one, but they kind of did the outro to a lot of those shows, and it was muted. But Dennis is looking into the camera after he wins against Gary Porter one time, and you can see him say, "I kicked his." And so they have fun. There's friendly rivalries, but I love it.
That was Flemington. That was the Trucks and Tractor Power episode of Flemington that particular thing happened on. Matt Stoltz pointed that out to me last week, and I meant to bring it up on the podcast last week, but we kind of ran out of time as we were trying to wind things up, and it just one of those things that kind of slips your mind. You hit the end record button, you're like, "Oh, darn it, I forgot to mention."
But they had fun. I like the rivalries with a little edge, though. There's nothing wrong with little Porter and Anderson anytime for me, but that little rivalry with the edge, there was a lot of drama, and they loved that from a TV perspective, to have Stevens coming up there and gunning for Brass and then burning up clutches and transmissions on the line, doing mind games and all that stuff.
Staging, everything. The stage battle in Flemington's one that pops out into my head. The big one that really pops out into a lot of people's heads is Dallas in 1990 after Stevens wins a race. And they're interviewing him. I don't even think Bigfoot was in the race, come to think of it. And he just turns around and goes, "I just want to point out Bigfoot hasn't made it out of round number 2 since he's been on fair and equal equipment with us." And that is like a gunfire right into the TNT and in Bigfoot's direction, as far as I'm concerned. That was on live television that Stevens said that. And at that moment on, Scott Stevens had the way that you looked at him was completely different than you had previously.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I thought too, watching that, as a kid, is it was actually nice that, I thought the same things, the crybaby and all that kind of stuff. But what actually was nice about it is that he did do that, because it really added to the show. It really added to the week in and week out rivalry between those guys. And, I would, at some of these rivalries we talk about, I think there's some that are a little more made for TV and made for interview, versus these ones that were probably real rivalries in terms of, Army like to say these guys don't like each other and all that kind of stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if this one with King Crunch and Scott Stevens and the Bigfoot guys were really, pretty real, considering his anti-lawsuit sticker on the front of the truck and all the things that he would say to the camera. But years later watching it, I like it, the fact that he was doing that, because it really made it that much more interesting, and really kind of brought that series together in terms of having that actual rivalry. And that's what they needed. They needed that. They needed all those stories. They needed the Bigfoot 8-4 back to 8. They needed Scott Stevens. They needed USA 1 flipping over, Gravedigger putting in his hero runs, and they needed Equalizer with the driver change. And there was so much happening that's what was so good about that season. And then Scott Stevens stepping up and kind of playing that role, and whether it was super serious or not, it really added to that season. I'm glad that he did it today.
Yeah, and to compare Scott Stevens to certain maybe villains in different motorsports, 1990s there was a guy named Jeff Gordon. Not many people liked him in NASCAR. Nowadays it's Kyle Busch. for NASCAR television. People that want to poke the bear and poke the thumb at somebody. That's you. That's the person that they're going to focus the most on TV. Usually, is that guy that is riling people up, and that's usually what a guy like Kyle Busch, a Jeff Gordon, guys like that would do back in the day as far as NASCAR would go. So that's a major reason why they were probably like, "Hey, Scott, you want to be an interview?" I mean, you weren't in the last race, but we could really use your opinion right here. That's part of the reason he was on the radio as well, and they would have the Racing Electronics radio, and they would have him in cab, King Crunch kicking some tail in Flemington, New Jersey. There's a reason you remember his quotes and what he would say, because he was that guy that was the antagonist for a team like Bigfoot. You had Andy Brass over there, the soft-spoken guy that would always think of sponsors. Well, you had Scott Stevens on the other side. Yeah, he'd think of sponsors, but he'd make sure you knew he wasn't really fond of that other big blue truck over there that also just happened to be a Ford.
100%.
Yeah, I mean,
100%.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is, I think that he could approach his interviews differently than some of the other guys because, he was the owner and driver of that truck, and you had a guy like Andy who he didn't own it. He was the driver. He had to be a representative. He couldn't call out all these guys necessarily on TV, and other than the little bit that he did. He didn't noticeably get really angry until maybe at the end of that 90 season when he thought they put too much water on the track. That's the only time I really saw him actually angry. The rest of the times you could see he was kind of trying to play the good guy role.
Oh, I don't know. Dallas 1990, when they banned 8 and they interviewed him, he was visibly upset there in that interview on that first show for Dallas. After that, though, like you said, he's just a soft-spoken guy in the background. You never really heard Andy pointing his finger at anybody in the pits and saying, that guy over there. That was always Stevens that was kind of pointing that finger out there on TV.
I want to bring up 2 points in regards to what you guys are both saying. First, the racing radio, the electronics, Crash Ford and Scott talking. For the love of all that is holy, why don't they do that now? That needs to be in every major telecast with everything. They played anything with Scott Stevens. They played Dennis's rollover from West Leb, and they're money. They're absolutely money. Why isn't that in today's sport? It's unacceptable to me. I mean, if you hire me, the first thing I'm doing is I'm miking all of you up, and we're going to get this footage, and it is going to rock. Because there's going to be raw emotion.
There's a reason that Radioactive on the NASCAR broadcast gets so many views on YouTube. People want to hear the bleep swear words from all the NASCAR drivers. It's the same thing as far as mic'd up for the NFL. They mic all those players up for one game, and they let that play out, and it's like a 10 or 15 minute combination video of that entire game from that one player or that one team.
Yeah, that raw emotion is what's up. And you guys were talking about people that kind of poke the bear a little bit. Mike Wine's a name that you got to bring up when it comes to that.
We'll get to Mike Wine a little bit later. I'm kind of saving him.
Okay. We'll save him. But yeah,
we want to keep going here into the Bigfoot rivalries, and of course there is, like we said, USA 1. We've said Equalizer. We've said King Crunch. One team that kind of always stuck around in the background that never really poked the bear or anything like that, but one team that's always had kind of an itch towards that blue truck is the Kong brothers back there. Awesome Kong, King Kong, those names. Just recently on Facebook, me and Jason were talking about this a minute ago. Steve Kane made a comment saying that no, Bob Chandler didn't create monster trucks, Jeff Dane did. I mean, these guys have a little bit of a rivalry back and forth with one another, and it all started on it didn't really all start here in TNT, but it was continued here in TNT with Awesome Kong and King Kong meeting up with the Big Blue Ford.
Yeah, that was the first name I actually put down was Bigfoot versus Kong, because I felt like that was it the return of the monster trucks. We're kind of sidebarring from TNT, but when they did Bigfoot versus Kong in the finals there, and Jim with 4 beats Jeff Dane driving the other truck, I thought that kind of set it into motion. And those guys obviously having sort of an internal dispute argument between the two of them, I'm sure over the years, on who started the monster truck craze between the two of them, and then it kind of went racing, and Jim and the Bigfoot getting the better end of those guys really every time in those days, up until they really made the skinny Awesome Kong that was really the one that started getting some wins over Bigfoot here and there. But to me, that's one that looked pretty serious. And those guys, we've seen them at the Hall of Fame together, Bob Chandler and Jeff Dane, and they're nice to each other now. You can see, but I'm sure that at one point or another, it was a little bit touchy between those guys.
Yeah, and you bring up the skinny truck too, and also return and battle of the monster trucks for that sidebar. I remember vividly renting and wearing out this thing that we used to watch things on called a VHS tape, and they had that made-for-TV deal where Kong went through the house and saved the person and all that. So that's quality stuff now. If you guys find that on YouTube, pull that up, watch it, have a good laugh. It's really good though. It promoted things and it was really cool. Hey, he hit that thing. He had one chance to do that. That's pretty slick. But the skinny awesome Kong is the one I'm always going to think of. But then when they had issues with that truck, they had to bring back the old one. And you know what? The old one worked out pretty well once they got a hold of that Janky sponsorship. And like I was talking about Bowling Green, clearing cars, mashing that big engine, and soaring to victory. That thing worked out pretty well. Sometimes the old trucks worked out well when they're a good extension of the driver too.
Yeah, I agree with you there. One race that always comes to my mind when I think of these two trucks is a race that is still controversial to this day. I had posted on a Facebook group after rewatching this race while I was writing notes for this. Does anybody have a side angle of this? Because it's never been found. It's never been shown. I was just curious, and I never got a reply back. Plenty of people liked the video. Nobody commented on it. The race I'm talking about, 1989, Houston Astrodome. I don't remember which day it was. Bigfoot was in the final for both days. I believe the first day he lost to Nightlife. Second day was Kong. I don't know. Somebody can correct me on that. But Awesome Kong wins the race. But when they cut away, it's interesting to me. Kong has momentum coming to the cars, but Bigfoot is first to the cars by not just a little bit. It's by over a truck length that Bigfoot has a lead here on Kong. But when they cut away, they just show the head-on shot of Kong coming at you, and it's flying through the air. It's doing Steve Kane things, even though I don't believe it was Steve Kane driving. I think it was Mark Brandt that was driving. The truck was in the air, flying Texan as usual, but you never saw a side angle of that finish. Kong is declared the winner. Brandt does a little celebration dance that looks like Michael Jackson, and then they cut away from everything.
Yeah, I watched that one. We talked earlier about I watched that one too, and yeah, that was another one where I just felt like it's like really had such a good weekend going here, made a decent turn and couldn't get the win, against Awesome Kong and that main in the Houston. To me, I always felt like this Houston Astrodome show was one of the biggest of the year. Obviously the big stadium. I love the big stadium floors for these kind of events, and I kind of thought this should have been a win. I don't know if, looking at the finish line or a side view, I don't really have that, as you mentioned, but it just felt like this was one of those days where it should have been a win, but it wasn't.
Calling Bob Chandler. Somebody's had to have videoed that, right? But seriously, I mean, I would have loved to have seen it. But those kind of things, as much as it hurts to, maybe from a driver perspective, you kind of from a TV perspective want a bit of that controversy, because then you know what? The story's written itself for the next week.
Another thing I'll point out here too really fast is Jason kind of linked me to a couple of races in Buffalo, New York between Kong and Bigfoot. And they are some of the closest races that I think TNT had seen up to that point. And this is, I believe it was 89, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, it was 89. Bigfoot was on the New York mini tour. Kong wins, and I would honestly, I'd have called it a dead heat in one of the races. And then the next race, Bigfoot wins by maybe a half a tire. Some very close racing there between those two guys. I believe it was Steve Kane doing the driving with Kong. And Kong, as you can see back in the day too, a lot of the times you would see that skinny Kong have a giant, you would assume that it was a sponsor, but it was actually the word sponsor written on the rear quarter panel of the truck, because they were looking for funding. They wanted to get out there and compete just like that every single week with Bigfoot. And unfortunately, they never quite got that big corporate deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of going back and watching the video here of this Houston Astrodome event too, and I'm looking at it, and like you said, it's like it'd be nice to see a side view of this, but I mean, you watch it, and there's even past the finish line where the two trucks collide. I think you mentioned.
Yeah, they touch rear wheels. Left rear,
Yeah.
right rear.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't think at any point after the finish line was Kong ever in front of Bigfoot here. And I'm like, where in the heck was the finish line at
Yeah.
here?
It's one of
But
those things where, I mean, the day before with Nightlife, it was pretty obvious Nightlife won by about a truck length.
yeah,
That one, I think that they didn't show it on TV because it was a bad call. That's just my opinion, and I'm sure we'll get roasted in the comments by somebody out there. I usually get every now and then somebody to make a big deal in my comment section, but I
Provide
mean,
the footage if you're going to roast. That's all
exactly.
I'm going to say.
Provide the footage before that roast. Anyway, we move on. We move on from the Kongs to probably, my opinion, I put it off long enough, the biggest rivalry in monster truck racing. Shoot me if you want to. Bigfoot versus Gravedigger. And I got to tell you, this is one that always, the reason that it sticks out to me is St. Paul, Minnesota, when Dennis Anderson finally gets a win over Bigfoot, and you hear how happy he is and how jubilant he is on the microphone when he gets that win with Grandma. And then we fast forward when we go into TNT. By this point, they have turned that rivalry into their Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon, or their Michael Jordan and whoever else is playing on the other team in the NBA Finals. Karl Malone, I'll throw that name out there. Just, it's one of those ones that every single time those two trucks would pull to the line, you almost had to sit up in your seat just a little bit.
yeah, and this is another one to me. I just feel like is everybody Bigfoot versus everyone. And I think when Gravedigger moved into this became a battle of money and popularity was what this battle became, where it was Bigfoot was the sponsored truck, the Ford backed, they had the money, the backing. Gravedigger was kind of coming up his own way, and without that type of sponsorship, and just was a great driver, put together a nice truck. But then the popularity, the sales, and the novelties is where the battle really, to me, is with those two trucks. It became, okay, well, actually, who's more popular here? Because at one point or another, it was an obvious Bigfoot landslide for who was the most popular. And then you could see even as far back as 89, 90, Scott Douglas starts saying that Gravedigger is the most popular monster truck in the world. And to me, I'm sure that became the big battle, not only on the track because you got Dennis Anderson, but I think it became a battle of who was actually the most popular and who was selling the novelties. And I'm sure that was, to me, that's the battle that I see between the two of them.
I got to jump in here real quick before you talk, Robbie. Jason's saying something reminded me of a video that Kristen Anderson posted. I believe it was on Father's Day.
Yes.
It's a video that's circulated around for a little bit, but it is one that I always like, and it's Dennis saying, "Hey, my wife went out and bought a Bigfoot T-shirt just so I could wipe my face off on it after the race was over with." And Bigfoot got a lucky break. It was just after Bigfoot had defeated Digger in a final round, but you could see they were friendly with one another. It was one of those rivalries where there was a lot of mutual respect. But boy, was it talked about largely on television.
The most exciting part of that rivalry and any rivalry involving Gravedigger is you are going to get an outstanding run. You are going to get 150. People joke about that one run thing, but you know what? That was what he had to do to stand out. You talk about, the Kong brothers, if you will. They were trying to do what Dennis eventually did with Gravedigger. And I think the difference was in personality and in driving style. They were great and they pushed, and, Kong has some famous crashes too, but Dennis week in and week out would do that and just had that barnstorming 52 weeks mindset. I'm going to run this thing until it won't anymore. That was the most exciting thing when they would pull to the line was, you're going to get my best shot. It might not be good enough to win, but it's not going to be because of me and because of lack of trying. It's going to be that I rang a drive shaft trying to get Foot, or that Foot, veered off course a little bit because of the locker that they had trouble with so much. There was going to be one good shot. You were going to get somebody's best effort. There was no laying down and whatever happened. That was so exciting as a kid. And Army Armstrong, Scott Douglas, they added to it. They played it up. And, little kid me, I got the merchandise. I paid for some of those drive shafts. I think everybody did to a certain point, and it's an amazing story. It's a feel good story when you think about it. Whether you love Dennis Anderson and Gravedigger or not, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that doesn't, at minimum, respect the way that he came through the ranks in running with, as an underdog against Bigfoot.
Yeah, and honestly, just to make a comparison to Dennis Anderson, and I bring up NASCAR a lot in my comparisons, but to me, Anderson is the equivalent of Dale Earnhardt. Dale started trying to race on the dirt. He eventually gets into asphalt, and he works his name up from there to become the biggest star in NASCAR history. Fight me in the comments if you want to on that one. Dennis, without a doubt, is the biggest name in monster trucks. And I'll throw that out there. I don't care what anybody says. That's the biggest name in motorsports as far as monster truck racing goes, is Anderson. When we look at this rivalry, though, there's a few races that always jump out to me. Fulton County Stadium in 1988, when Dennis takes Grandma on kill and tries to chase down Kramer, even going into his other lane and almost running down Bigfoot in his lane, and Kramer making that little thing that says, "Oh, Gravedigger, he'll never back off." One of those quotes. Then just Dennis would literally have that mindset where he's going to go or blow against Bigfoot. And the one that pops up into my head is Weed Sport in 89. Like I said, Bigfoot's on the New York Mini Tour in 89, and Dennis literally grenades the rear end out of the truck in a pass to try and beat Andy Brass and Bigfoot forward to the line. It's one of the coolest races because when you look at that in that old VHS quality, you can't really see what's going on there because there's so much smoke that's being thrown out of the bottom of Gravedigger.
Yeah, and what I see watching back at that stuff, and maybe this goes back to a comment that I had a video. Fred was up at the dungeon doing something, and Dennis was there, and he showed Dennis a video that we had been messing with, or that just came out about one of those old events, and Dennis watched it, and it was him racing Kramer. He's got Grandma, and Kramer's running Bigfoot 6, and he saw the video, and I guess he told Fred, he's like, "Yeah, that's when they started taking me seriously." Was like, I don't think he didn't beat Kramer in that race, the one that he was showing him, but he said that's when they started taking me seriously. And when I watched some of that stuff, and when you hear Jim kind of comment, I don't think they were taking him very seriously up until those points where they were like, "Man, this guy isn't going away. This guy is running his equipment hard." And I think there was a period of time where I'm sure for a lot of these trucks, they didn't take them very seriously because, they had so many more wins over these guys, and so much more on the table in terms of their equipment and their backing, that there were some people that they just didn't take seriously. And I think it was up until those events Josh is talking about where they were finally like, "Yeah, old Gravedigger, he's never gonna let off." To me,
he's never gonna let off at all.
Yeah, to me, those are the comments where you can see where it's like, they were not necessarily being real genuine. It was more like, yeah, he's got this truck that's not really up to our standards, but he's running it hard, and we know he's going to do it. And there was a little bit to that, I think, in those interviews, but it wasn't long after that where they definitely had to take him very seriously all the way around.
I had something real quick for that too. You brought up a good point, Jason. I think with the authenticity when it comes to Dennis, and I wanted to share a quick story. I don't think I've heard anywhere else because I was around to see it. This is a quick touch on a Monster Jam thing. They would do those behind the scenes interviews, and this is Monster Jam at Minneapolis in probably, I would say 2012 or so. And they're doing behind the scenes interviews before the show. No crowd in there. It's just like pre-pit party type of deal. They say, "Well, who is your favorite truck to run against?" And Dennis says, "Bigfoot." I mean, you can't get more authentic than that. It wasn't played up. He had no reason to say that other than that was his favorite truck to run against. That's how he's always operated. And there was that mutual respect there, but also a mutual respect with, we're going to shake each other's hands with one hand, and we're going to have that knife behind our back with the other hand, ready to duel. And I love that about that whole rivalry. That's why I think it made it so vivid, even to this day. Is they were authentic about it. There wasn't any made for TV stuff. They just really wanted to beat each other, and they really matched up a lot and gave it their all every time. There were no duds in those unless there was a breakage involved.
And if you want to see exactly what we're talking about as far as this rivalry goes, we're going to go to the very last race that these two guys competed against each other, or these two teams had competed against each other in TNT. And that, of course, is the famous, hey, we were going to interview Dennis, but he's not here. So here's Andy Brass, who was racing him last week in a non-televised event. And they show the timing tape footage of Bigfoot and Gravedigger from Middletown, New York. And you see Digger 2 racing Bigfoot 8, this radically highly designed, more advanced suspension travel truck in the final round. And Dennis is right there with that truck with the old Digger number 2. I mean, it's one of those races that just screams, holy crap, where did he come from to even be that close to that truck? And of course, what happens is Dennis ran the truck way too hard probably and ended up driving the front of the truck into the wall in an attempt to try and beat Brass and Bigfoot.
Yeah, I remember when I was watching that episode and, when it came on, and I was just like, where's this event? Why can't we see this one? I was so mad because it's like, why can't we see this event? This is the one we want to see. And yeah, I mean, to me, when I watch that video, I kind of feel like, during that season, we talked about the Bigfoot 8 thing, and I kind of feel like he would run that truck. Sometimes he would run it hard. Sometimes they wouldn't run it very hard. But I think in that race, you can see that it was really close. Maybe even Digger had a little tiny lead over the first set, as you said, and he ran it hard, and then Andy, got on it through the second set. It looked like he got a nice little win out of it. But that's what really stuck out is like you talked about the Digger 2 being kind of underrated as a leaf spring truck, and I think there's a lot of things you get blinded by because of a lot of the breakage and issues that they had doing the one run thing and the qualifying passes. But like you said, when it ran successfully, it was probably maybe the third, fourth fastest truck on the TNT, maybe.
I'm a little biased. I would have said the first fastest truck in TNT,
but well, I mean, you think, if you got Bigfoot 8 and Equalizer, I think those are the top two. USA 1's ground speed and overall top end, and then I think Gravedigger 2 right there with USA 1. But to me, those are probably the 4 fastest trucks, and then you probably had not USA 1, but you had Carolina Crusher being consistent, fast and consistent. It was kind of like the Bigfoot 4 kind of truck, and then probably King Crunch right there with all his different versions that he had. But I think that Digger 2, like you said, was underrated as a leaf spring truck. It was quick.
And Dennis knew how to drive it. Make no mistake as far as that. It wasn't just always foot to the floor. When they would run the indoor shows like a Memphis or something like that, there was always that big roller hill and then the no man's land and then the cars. And if you hit that wrong, well, you were going to take a big fat L. Dennis learned how to kind of get the front end of the truck to bounce and clear the stack. And that was really important. That takes finesse. That's not just somebody going out there and mashing it over the hill and hoping that things work out for the best. He had some strategy behind it, and there were other times where he would admit, frankly, to the cameras, you know what, I got ahead of myself, or I really messed that one up, or I need to be calm, I need to be cool and collected. He got jazzed up to drive, but when he had his head together and his truck together, he was hard to beat. And Flemington, we talked about that briefly. Dude, I'm so mad I didn't get on that one. Oh man, that was one of the biggest memories and just a rivalry weekend. That's the Golden Corral buffet of rivalries that weekend, and just one that, if you guys haven't seen Flemington, I don't care who you're a fan of, how you're a fan of it, please go watch the Flemington weekend of monster trucks. Dennis got some validation for a lot of hard work and just tons of trucks doing great things on that course. So many rivalries. That's TNT in a nutshell to me.
Speaking of rivalries, as we keep on going with this conversation, we're going to skip ahead just a little bit because I know Robbie's going to have to leave here shortly, and we want to talk about another Gravedigger rivalry. There's two Digger rivalries that I wanted to talk about in this episode. We'll close it out with the number one, I think, as far as TNT goes, but we're going to go ahead and talk about Digger and Outlaw right here. And I got to tell you, Mike Wine, like you were talking about earlier, one of those guys, like me and Jason have talked about on this show before. If you put Mike Wine in a professional wrestling ring, he could cut a promo better than 90% of the WWE roster.
Yeah, when I go back and I watch that stuff, and I see Mike Wine talking to the camera, he really got it. He really understood kind of what was going on in the business. He understood that he needed to have a personality. He needed to mention his sponsors, and he needed to have a rival. It was important because obviously he was running a Ford truck. He knew that there was already a Bigfoot Ford truck. He needed to stand out in some way. And I think that's what was really smart about what he was doing with his interviews is he was standing out. And he kind of picked a rival with Dennis Anderson. And I kind of felt like at times they kind of played that up a little bit for fun.
Yeah, I did too.
And I feel like that was something that they kind of got together and said, hey, we can kind of play with this a little bit and have some fun. But then you mentioned that when they got on the track, you mentioned the big wheelie that Dennis did in '89, and you can tell that there was they had to back it up, right? Even though they might have been saying it in fun or in jest or whatever, but it's like, man, I got to back it up here, and he was trying to back it up.
Yeah, and that race that you're speaking of happens to have one of those. People love that interview for some reason. I've always felt it was a little fabricated between Mike Wine, Dennis, and Army Armstrong. When Dennis just kind of comes into the camera and says, "Hold on," and Mike Wine turns, "That takes 10 Chevrolets to touch one Ford." That conversation that's going on right there. I always thought that was a little fabricated, but Mike Wine made it seem like it wasn't. Yeah. And Mike was always so sincere too in his interviews as well. He was thanking his sponsors and how much it meant to him to have somebody put money into him and into that team. That was another thing that always kind of got overlooked as far as Mike Wine goes. But when these two trucks were on the track, I wrote down 4 things that would usually happen. Number 1, Gravedigger would break. Number 2, Outlaw would break. Number 3, Digger would straight up win, or Digger would do something absolutely spectacular, and that's what happened in that particular '89 race when Anderson comes off the hill just a little bit wrong, misjudges it, hits the front tires into the finish line jump, and just launches into one of the wickedest sky wheelies you think you ever saw a leaf-sprung truck get.
Yeah, and I think it was brought up earlier about Dennis being such a good driver, and I think what he figured out on those courses, that was mentioned was getting the front wheels up over the first set of cars. He'd do the roller and he'd almost do the first slap wheelie, right? Where the front would hit after the roller, it'd get in the air, and then he knew that he could stay on it and power through the cars. And that was the workaround, not having a really good suspension in those days to attack that track, because to get over the roller and then get the truck to settle and then jump, everyone felt like you had to jump with the front wheels, but he figured out that he could jump with the rear wheels and be powering through the whole time. And he kind of discovered that workaround to make a leaf spring truck do those courses very quick. And he dominated there. It was at the beginning of '89 when he was dominating a little bit, and had a lot of good runs. And he was mastering that wheelie. And then, like you mentioned, maybe a little miscalculation on the run there against the Outlaw.
Hey, Biloxi, man, I will never forget that. That thing was a freaking rocket when you can take 16,000 pounds and put it on the back wheels, and of course that's short. It was ridiculous, and the problem was he
might have had a little help with the Rodeck.
I was going to say the problem was he couldn't keep the drivetrain together because he was making so much power from the engine. He ended up working that out and having to have that worked out, if you will, rules wise. So they ended up making that work. But the thing that struck me as I rewatched TNT's '89 and '90 seasons this year as an adult versus as a kid. As a kid, you talked about wrestling and cutting promos. There's kayfabe, and then there's the other half of it, right? So you got to think about Mike Wine was a master at that and mind games getting in people's heads, but it was also made for TV. But as a little 5-year-old kid, I was going, I don't like him. I don't like Mike Wine. And my dad's looking at the TV and telling Mike Wine to shut up. And, it turns out, if you guys have ever met him, he's a sweetheart. He is
one of the nicest guys you will ever meet.
Nicest and most supportive guys. When I was a young crew guy that makes a great podcaster as a crew guy, Mike was willing to help anybody. I saw it with my own eyes and always had the room in stitches. That personality, the only thing he played up about his personality was the rivalry and the not like each other. They liked each other. They had a great time running up and down the road. There were probably some rental cars out there still waiting to be found. And I love the fact that, they did that and they pulled it off. But looking back on that as an adult, I gained a lot of respect for Mike Wine. I think if he would have had that Super Winch sponsorship and some of the other money come in maybe a year or two earlier, I think we would have been talking about him a lot more. I think his equipment was just a little bit behind the curve, and that hurt him. When he got into Equalizer, even with a broken Equalizer in Memphis after all that drama with Gary Cook and David Morris, he still was able to take that truck and do nice things. If he had the equipment, I believe he could have been, a top 5 driver in there.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Mike Wine, I mean, his second kind of run in the sport when he got into Monster Jam could show you exactly what kind of a driver he was. He was one of those guys that, I mean, you could put him in anything, he could drive it. And that's exactly what Mike Wine could do. I don't see him not really ever being mentioned as far as in the upper echelon of the sport, as far as I'm concerned. He may not have ever really been like one of those guys that would win every week, but he is certainly one of those guys that you remembered from every week's show that he was on.
I want to have Mike on the Monster Truck podcast so badly, and he lives about 15 minutes from me now. I might do an in-person one. We got to figure that out. But man, the stories he can tell, the passion that he has for the sport, and the way he could explain things so that the viewing audience at home was taken in with him and with whatever story they were trying to tell is top tier.
The thing that stands out to me about his interviews that I was laughing about, kind of going over stuff, was him talking about the new, the sponsorships they would acquire, and he's like, they just pumped in $27,000 into our, and I'm like, how often do you get the guy mentioning the actual money amount that the sponsor?
Yeah, that is something that I've never seen in an interview to this day, other than when Mike Wine would do it. You listen to some of these NASCAR drivers out there, and you wonder, I wonder how much money that Gravedigger or Monster Jam had to pay to get the name on the side of Kevin Harvick's car. Well, Harvick's not going to tell you that, and neither Stewart Haas Racing, but it's always something you kind of want to know. Mike Wine, if he'd have been on that team, that was $3 million.
Yeah, yeah.
We could build 3 more monster trucks if we put Outlaw on the side of a NASCAR.
Yeah, he was like the classic, telling you too much. He like really went into it, and that always made me laugh. That how much detail he was giving about the sponsorship or whatever the case may be. It was kind of it was really funny to go back and you hear that stuff and I wonder what the owner, Nick Rossi, was thinking. It's like, man, you can't tell him how much money we're getting, and it's like, he just got our new engine,
We'll kind of skip back now, and we'll go talk about a rivalry from 1989 that honestly I think gets kind of brushed under the rug because of the big 2 years of TNT. 89 was still a great year in TNT, but 88 and 90 seem to be the 2 darlings that people talk about on the internet quite a bit. And that's the season rivalry that we had between Equalizer and Carolina Crusher. One side, you got the big clunky truck from North Carolina that still somehow managed to make it into the semifinals or finals just about every week. On the other side, you had the more advanced truck with David Morris behind the wheel, Gary Cook's ingenuity, building a truck that, in all honesty, if you look at a year later when a certain blue truck come onto the track, it makes you wonder why there wasn't an uproar about this particular truck in 89. And that's, of course, Equalizer and Carolina Crusher.
Yeah, I remember watching that season, even though there wasn't a lot of Bigfoot action, and always kind of baffled me, why Equalizer was as good as it was. The weight. They didn't talk about the weight a whole lot then, but now you learn how lightweight the truck was, and you learned a little more about the suspension and understood. And the Carolina Crusher, just to me, just was like the solid, stage 2 monster truck, right? The Bigfoot 4 style stage 2 kind of truck that I don't know if did he ever roll it over. I don't know that he ever rolled over Carolina Crusher 2.
He got pretty close in Richmond in 1990 when he popped the 2 tires off to the side of it, but that was about as hard as you saw Gary really drive. I'll actually take that back. He did have one wild ride in Louisville as well at the figure 8 track where he bounced it, did the slap wheelie basically down the straightaway right there to try and go into the wide turn. But that was about as wild as you saw Gary ever really get.
Yeah, that's as much a credit to Porter as it is to the equipment, to me. I mean, the equipment was outstanding, make no mistake. I mean, think about this. Equalizer's chassis ran for like 20, I don't want to say like 20 more years in various stages. And Porter's Crusher too for a lesser degree, but it was kind of interesting to see that truck eventually become bad medicine. We kind of all know, what happened there if you've been following monster trucks. The driver makes a lot of difference when it comes to that stuff, and Porter was again that great combination that enabled him to overcome some of the maybe limitations of his truck, and the fact that he was able to do that brought him up to the Equalizer level and made those races fun to watch.
What really made the races fun to watch, for me anyway, back when you were rewatching 89 TNT, is the fact that Porter would always favor a lane. It would always generally be the good lane as far as what everybody would say. Everybody would always say, oh, well, just use for example, that right lane over there, that's the great lane. That's where we're going to be all night until somebody kicks us over out of it. You'd look at David Morris, he'd almost kind of grin, be like, all right, cool, give me the left lane, I'll take it. And he would take the bad lane that everybody hated and turn it into the great lane for him and end up stealing victory after victory after victory out of that other side.
Yeah, like I said, you talked about the Equalizer tended to make the bad lane into the good lane for itself, and it seems like you could never throw it into the bad lane. And maybe that was just the superiority of that truck, was the fact that it could run in the bad lane and it could also win. And like you said, it is kind of strange. Nobody ever complained that the truck had a big advantage. And I think that, I think this just goes back to, they felt like Gary Cook was another kind of backyard garage tech designer engineer, and it wasn't a money thing that he had put into that truck. They felt like it was, just some knowledge and tractor parts that he was able to put together and make a killer truck, where they felt like the Bigfoot guys were doing it with money and computer aided design. And I feel like that they kind of got named out of that one. I think in terms of Equalizer, I think they felt like, all right, well, this guy just came up with a better mousetrap, and he kind of figured it out, and he didn't have a lot of money, but he figured it out, and they were okay with it. But
as far as I don't mean to cut you off, but as far as the 1989 rivalry between these two, one race always jumps out at me. It's Richmond International Speedway, day one in '89. Rollover for Equalizer. Left front tire gets ripped off. Morris has one of the more iconic shots in monster truck racing, basically climbing out of the windshield and looking around like, hey guys, what happened? Kind of a thing. And one thing that always stood out to me as far as that rivalry would go was that particular event and that particular day, because they turn a 12-point lead into an 11-point loss, and they still walk out with the lead from the weekend. And they gain, and essentially they keep gaining points as the tour goes on.
Yeah, it just shows you when those guys buckled down, in all these teams, when they buckled down and they wanted to fix something, it seemed to happen. I don't know what kind of late nights that these crews and drivers would sustain back then. But I mean, I think on our RC side, I remember Paul Wynn, I was coined the phrase, I pulled an all-nighter. And I'm sure these guys were pulling an all-nighter all the time.
Yeah, and before Robby gets out of here, he's dying to talk about one specific race, and that leads us into the very next rivalry, and to me, is one of the biggest rivalries in TNT, and that, of course, is the old black and green wrecking machine Gravedigger and Rod Litzow and Everett Jasmer over there in that white USA 1 truck.
Absolutely. Yeah, really appreciate, we got to say, appreciate both of you guys having me and love talking with you. Have discussions with you anytime, Jason. We'll talk Bigfoot and Gravedigger anytime. But yeah, man, when I think of TNT overall, if you just think of the series, I think of one race first and foremost, and that's Kalamazoo. That's Gravedigger. That's USA One. That's two of the hardest running drivers of all time. Everything is perfect. Trucks are good, the drivers are good, and they're giving 110%. You see Dennis's truck take those three huge hops, and you know he's got the thing pinned the whole time because you hear it go, wow, wow, wow. You could just hear the engine.
Oh, yeah.
And just flying. You don't know what's going on. You're left just looking around like the Tasmanian devil just tore through here. And both of those trucks were on kill, as Dennis liked to say. I love that phrase. I love that terminology. I think it fits everything. He used to say we try to nail people to the wall. That time he got him. It was at the expense of his truck, but you know, I just love that race. I love those series. I love the fact that they do that. There's nothing wrong with some good, hard, straight line racing. I don't care if you're a Monster Jam fan or what you are nowadays. Those races were some of the best of all time. And that one, man, that's an easy top 5 for me, if not very near the top. Just an amazing race. It sums up what a rivalry should be, in my opinion, when it comes to motorsports. Everybody's 100%. Let's see who's the very best, and let's put it on kill and see who comes out with the win.
Yeah, two of the hardest drivers right there is an understatement, I think. Rod Litzow, like we said, got the nickname Flipper. Boy, if shoes had been on the other foot, I mean, we could be talking about USA One today instead of Gravedigger for all that matters. But just to kind of kick on to everything here, that particular race that you're talking about, Robby, Dennis's truck always seemed to want to kick to one side or the other on those outdoor courses. And that one, it kicks hard right in the air. And they spend quite a lot of time trying to decide, okay, who actually won this race? And eventually they give the win to Gravedigger. Dennis, of course, after he gets the win, they kind of pan the camera over and you see the truck kind of leaning to one side and the right front tire saying, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, but you know what? He got the win, and that's a psychological thing. And I'll just say real quickly before I get out of here, my dad actually got to know Edward Jasmer a little bit, a few years ago through some actual RC stuff, some of that hobby. And he told a story to my father about those Monday morning calls or those Sunday night at midnight calls. And when he would get upset with Litzow, he got the full government name. He got Rodney. What happened with the truck this weekend? And you know what? Dennis didn't have to answer to anybody for that one but himself. So it was a great rivalry talk. I really appreciate you guys having me on. And guys, if you're not, I'm definitely going to send everybody both your ways. I really appreciate everything.
Hey, thanks, Robby. Thanks for joining us, man.
Thank you.
To touch on the USA One and Gravedigger thing here, with that particular race in general, Jason, the one thing that really jumps out to me is what happens to Litzow after that. Because Rod comes back in the finals because Dennis wrecked. He's taking on Equalizer. And you thought the Digger ride was wild. Rod goes out and flips the dang truck, racing Equalizer in the very next round. If that doesn't tell you how hard both of those drivers were for both of those particular trucks, I don't know what does.
Yeah, what stood out to me at that point was these guys we have hit a point where they're pushing past the limit. And we talked about, or you and Matt talked about how USA One had trouble stopping, the limited braking ability that the truck had, the truck's proclivity, I guess you could say, to brake axles, and then limit the braking. And that was starting to become an issue. Digger, with Dennis's driving, I always felt like he was right on the verge as well of going as fast as those trucks could go. And they were starting to get injured. Rod got injured to the point where he didn't want to really continue driving anymore. And, Dennis never got that injury that kept him out of it until, really a couple of years ago. Yeah. He got a serious injury, but back then he was, like you said, hitting the wall there in Middleton and all these different things. He'd come back, but they were starting to get to the point, and that event really kind of to me, I remember watching that as a kid going, this is getting a little bit borderline here. This is starting to get a little crazy. I mean, a rod flipping over the way he did. Um, you know, it looked like a more of a, you know, like your NASCAR analogies, but they're starting to get NASCAR-ish crashes off of those trucks, um, and that you could see that something had to really kind of change and something had to be done, because if you were to just get more trucks with the power that those two trucks had and the drivers that had the same goal, um, you would have just had more and more of these devastating crashes, I think.
Yeah, and we did. As far as after this particular event, '89 was filled with some of those races where you were just like almost holding you're gritting your teeth at the end of the finish line, just wondering, are they going to be able to stop? That happened a lot in 1990. The biggest one, like when I had Doug on the podcast and we talked about Dallas 1990 with trucks just USA 1 hitting a generator, Buffalo Trimmer hitting the wall, and then Army Armstrong doing a little like standing between the two tire marks on the wall, doing an interview and talking about, well, this is where Buffalo Trimmer ended up. I mean, the braking on those trucks in TNT, yeah, it produced a lot of good racing from guys that really were going extremely hard, like Dennis, like Rod, like Andy Brass, like John Pyant when he was behind the wheel of Bigfoot 4. But like Steve Wilkie, I'll throw his name out there too. I can't leave him out of this because we're going to talk about him in just a minute as far as the Flemington race that Digger and USA 1 had. But trucks were almost borderline unsafe by the end of TNT, and thankfully things started to pick up safety-wise after that 1990 season was over with.
Yeah, and you know, you could see, to me, you know, like you talked about USA 1 hitting that generator in Dallas, and to me, that truck was too fast for its own good, really. For its ability to stop, and the speed on that thing without the planetaries, the weight and the horsepower ratio on that truck was incredible, but it couldn't stop, and it was crash prone. It couldn't stop, and that was going to become an issue, and I think that all the flips, what was it, 9 crashes, and it really started.
I believe 9 crashes overall for USA 1 and TNT.
Yeah, and you think about then Dennis Anderson's the one with the wild name, right? But that truck was upside down 9 times, and it's like Dennis, he didn't really have those major turnovers with number 2.
Well, he had one pretty good turnover in a backyard in North Carolina shortly after they rebuilt the truck back up. But man, as far as the USA 1 rivalry goes, to me that was always, at least in TNT Motorsports, that was the one where you almost wanted to lean forward in your seat and really watch it really closely because you knew what these trucks were going to do. And it all started in Hampton, Virginia in 1988 when they raced each other for the first time, when Rod's first weekend behind the wheel. Rod goes on to win the event, ironically, because Dennis breaks down in the semifinal round. Grandma Digger smokes USA 1 in that race. It was one of those good lane, bad lane situations. Dennis was the top qualifier, so of course he's going to take that good left lane. Rod gets stuck over the right. Rod gets a bad bounce. USA 1 at that moment in time is out of it, but he still runs hard across the cars trying to chase Dennis back down. It's just how he was, and that's just how Dennis was.
Yeah, and it's really, you know, the more we talk about it, the more those two trucks, the rivalry wasn't just in talk, and it wasn't just in for camera. It really kind of translated to the track. Maybe that is one of the best translated to the track rivalries out there. And I saw an interview with Dennis. I was on YouTube talking about how he was, in so many words, really kind of jealous that USA 1 had the Chevrolet backing and some sponsorships, and I always kind of felt like that should have been his in a way, I think. And you know, that really translated to the track with those two trucks, and you know, just those, you know, the ones, you know, we were just talking about. I mean, man, what a run, you know, that run that Dennis had in Digger there, and beating USA 1, and it was just, that was a fantastic race.
Yeah, and you want to talk about Dennis and Chevrolet. I mean, there's always been an argument in monster truck racing. We all know the number one Ford truck as far as monster truck goes. To me, and to just about anybody else, it's the big blue truck in Pacific, Missouri right now, and that's Bigfoot. The number one Chevrolet truck in monster trucks. It seems to have jumped around year after year after year after year, but Dennis always seemed to think that he was the number one Chevrolet truck in the world. There was even a point in mid-90s where it's a famous clip of Anderson opening the door of Digger number 7, and on the inside of the door is a giant hand-painted red Chevrolet logo as he's waving to the crowd. Dennis is a hardcore Chevrolet guy. That's how that truck had almost always been. Even when Grandma had a 51 Ford body, it ended up with a Chevrolet motor inside of it. That's just the way how Dennis had been. And that's ultimately the biggest rivalry in the sport, and it's always going to be, and that's Ford and Chevrolet. I can think of no better one to really end the podcast with than Ford and Chevrolet.
What I see between Gravedigger and USA One is what ultimately got USA One the Chevrolet deal was the ability to use a stock 88 Chevy body and look like a truck that you could sell. That's what was probably getting them the support. That's what was Chevrolet was backing the TNT series. They were the sponsors on TV. They were the sponsors of the series. He could kind of write his own, direction there, so to speak, because of the way the truck was almost built to the specifications to be a sponsored type of truck. And ultimately, that's why it was the one that was probably had the support from Chevrolet, was because of that, because they had something to sell. They could say, okay, there was an 88 Chevy, you can go buy an 88 Chevy. And then with Gravedigger, his truck was built, sort of the opposite. It was almost built just because of the body style, but Chevrolet wasn't going to sponsor a 50s panel truck because they're not selling 50s panel trucks anymore. So to them, I'm sure they're like, well, what's the point of sponsoring this thing? Because we're not selling these anymore. We're selling 88, 90s Chevy truck body, Chevy trucks, and that's what we want to show here. And it probably didn't make any sense to them. But ultimately, the paint job sold on Gravedigger to the fans. So really what he did is he got a sponsorship from the fans, and USA One got a sponsorship from the manufacturer.
Yep.
And that's probably the difference between the two of them. Bigfoot kind of had both, since they were in there for a long time. They got the sponsorship from Ford because it looked like a truck. But then they also were sponsored by the fans because they had a big following. But Dennis was ultimately, I think, sponsored by the fans.
Yeah, there's a reason that he thanks him for every shingle on his roof and every nut and bolt that he's got in his garage, or however that saying goes. He always said after he flipped over in freestyle. But I got to tell you, like I said, USA One Gravedigger to me is the pinnacle of TNT rivalries, just because of the driving ability between those two trucks. Like you said, USA One might have been more marketable, but Digger marketed itself to the fans, and it certainly paid off for that particular truck, that vehicle, and all of us people that could still watch a Gravedigger truck to this day. Honestly, we could talk for hours, days, decades if we wanted to on monster truck rivalries. This is just kind of a part one in this little series. There's much more that I want to talk about as far as monster truck rivalries as we get down the road. I know there are a lot of people that probably listen to this all the way at the end and going, what about Barefoot? I know that's definitely one of the ones that's popping in there. Barefoot wasn't in TNT. This is a TNT rivalry show. But we'll get to it eventually, guys. Don't worry. Until then, though, I got to say, we're going to go ahead and stop it right here, and we will definitely see you guys again on the tracks across America.